Hello and welcome to an Everyday Canines video. Today we're talking about the basics of weave poles. So this is an introduction to what the weave poles are, what you would expect to see and what you would expect to use in your training. So the set of weave poles you get in competition, this is a full competition set, Kennel Club spec. Let's start with the poles themselves. So these are plastic poles. You'll see more and more plastic poles these days. But you can also have wooden poles. Wooden poles are obviously slightly harder if the dog knocks them. These are obviously very flexible. So some dogs, when they're powering through the weaves, they really bang into the weaves. And these do give a bit more than wooden poles. But wooden poles are still acceptable. The specification in Kennel Club is that your poles should be of a rigid construction and of a height which is 76.2 centimetres. That's the minimum height they can be. So you wouldn't ever have metal poles or anything like that, because though it's a rigid construction, it would be far too harsh on the dog if they banged into it. So though your poles have to be a minimum of 76.2 centimetres, they can be taller. These are what I'd call closer to FCI heights, which is the international heights, so they're considerably taller. You will also see weave poles that are shorter. That is something to take into consideration when you are training a dog, because some dogs do struggle with the different heights. If they come across a pole that is taller when they've only trained on short poles, that can cause problems. So that's why when I've got my weaves, I've got two sets, tall poles, and I've also got short poles. Next, we need to look at the base itself. Now, as I say, these are competition spec, so this is metal. And you wouldn't expect to see anything else in competition but metal bases. However, in training, you could easily have plastic bases. There are some training weave sets that have a plastic base to them. That would be fine for training purposes. And equally, you can have weaves in your training set which are, they call them stick in the ground weaves. So what they are, they're a pole with a spike on the end which you just put in the ground yourself, so there's no base at all. But in competition, and certainly if you're starting to get to a stage where you're wanting to really work at competition level, you're going to want to have metal base, because it is more substantial. When the dogs run through them, it is not going to go too far. Yes, obviously we're on wobbly ground, so it's still got a wobble to it, but they're much more substantial, especially with bigger dogs. I've got little dogs, so I get away with lighter poles. Similarly, with plastic poles, they can be a bit more flexible and they can knock out of shape and you're constantly having to readjust. So when you reach a stage where you think, I'm going to take this really seriously, I really want to be competitive level, you're probably going to want to have metal-based poles. But in the training stages, certainly I did. I started with stick in the ground poles, no base, and then I moved on to poles with plastic bases. The space between the weave poles, so this space, always 60 centimetres. There's no, not quite, not under, not more, it's always 60 centimetres. If you happen to go and buy some second-hand weave poles, you will need to double check the distance, because there used to be a smaller space between, and some of the older poles you might come across, if they haven't had the bases, the spaces adjusted, you may find they're actually shorter. I tend to look at it and think to myself, they should be roughly 2 of my feet and a little bit. Obviously I know that how big my feet are. So for me, I can look at it and say, that's how much it should be. But yeah, so you just need to double check that, because obviously it does make a difference when you're training your dog. Tighter poles are harder, wider space poles typically are easier. However, it does depend on the size of your dog. Smaller dogs may actually find it easier to have tighter poles. So, but it is important to bear that in mind, and the same difference if you're using stick in the ground. When you're spacing them out yourself, make sure you are putting 60 centimetres between them. There are things like you can buy measuring guides, which is like a piece of webbing that you put between them that gives you the exact measurement. I used to just use a ruler, a long metre stick, so I could adjust my poles and make sure they were the right length. In terms of the number of poles, this is a full set of 12. The Kennel Club specifications say you can see a minimum of 5, and a maximum of 12. Now, quite frankly, I have never ever seen a set of 5 weave poles in competition, and I was quite surprised when I read that on the Kennel Club site to double check specifications, because I have never ever seen 5. Same applies, you can have 9 weave poles, which would be here, and you very rarely see 9 weave poles, though a few years ago it would have been more common, you would sometimes come across it. The reason these odd numbers are not so popular is partly because when the dog comes out of the weave poles on odd numbers, they come out on this side. So they'll either come out on this side. When they come out on even numbers, they come out on this side. Now, for a lot of dogs, because of the way weaving is for them, the way it's set up, they become into a habit, a muscle memory of it. When they come out on the wrong side, on an uneven set of numbers, that really throws them. And you can see some dogs will just come out. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll come out early because they don't want to do that last switch back, or they'll come out and be very confused. There are other reasons why you don't see those uneven numbers of poles in competition so much, but for me that's the main reason. It's also slightly harder when you're a competitor to make sure your dog is doing the correct number of them when they are uneven. What you will usually see is sets of 6, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, this one, and sets of 12. I would go out on a limb and say 99% of the time you will either see a set of 6 or a set of 12, and it's very unusual these days to see anything other. Whatever number of weave poles you have, they should always be in a straight line, a continuous straight line, it states. So if you look at my base is pretty straight. I'm going to be honest, don't look at the poles, because they are floppy, they move, but you look at the base piece and I can see, I might just need to wiggle it that way a bit, but it's almost completely straight. And it is important when the dogs are weaving that it should be straight. It's obviously better for them to do that with their bodies. If you start to have curves in weave poles, you think to yourself, the dog has got to do this. If you start then adding a curve, so they've got to start going, you're adding extra strain onto the body. This weave poles are the hardest skill your dog will have to learn in agility, and it is the most strenuous on their bodies. So when we're looking at weave poles from a safety perspective, we want nice straight lines, because that is the easiest for the dog to do, rather than starting to put extra strain by having wobbles. So the last thing to bear in mind with weave poles is this part, the metal support bar that sticks out from where the pole sits. So if I turn it this way, you can see you have your pole, your metal support bar. This is to stabilise the weaves so they don't fall all over. You can often have them, I've got holes in mine, so they can be pegged into the ground, or sometimes in shows where you're on sandy surfaces, they'll dig them in just to give them that extra support, because obviously otherwise your weave poles will, after a few uses, they'll go all over the place. The thing to bear in mind with your support poles is, if you can see, they're uneven. So I've got one this side, one that side. There is a reason for that. If you see, this is the start of your weaves. The dog always comes in on this side. The support bar is always on the side opposite where the dog is going to weave. So the dog is going to come this side, the support bar is there. The dog is going to come to this side, the support part is on the opposite side of them. The reason for this is so they're not standing on the bar, potentially causing themselves an injury if they caught a nail on it or something like that. Other factor is they can get quite hot in the sun in summer, so it's another thing that they're not having to stand and potentially burn their paws. So you always have your feet opposites. I have seen people make weave poles, and there's plans where the support bar goes all the way across, which looks logical. You think, oh excellent, that will make a good sturdy base, but it's wrong. You shouldn't have that. There should always be that gap on the side your dog weaves. And when we get to the next videos, that'll even become clearer why that is. So that's your basic introduction to weave poles, what they are, what you would expect to see, and why they are for safety reasons. I hope you've enjoyed this Everyday Canines video. If you have, you might subscribe to the YouTube channel, and you can check us out on Facebook and Instagram. And I hope to see you all again very, very soon.